The heat on planet Ferox 7 was unbearable, its sun a constant threat, burning everything it touched. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the sand felt like it could swallow anything in its path. Commander Alira, a fierce warrior from the Uxari Empire, stood in the middle of this harsh world, her violet skin shimmering under her golden armor. She was a skilled fighter, known for surviving the most dangerous places, but nothing had prepared her for this. Her ship had crashed after a vicious attack by pirates, and now, with no way of contacting help, she found herself stranded on this deadly planet. Her 6 serene, small creatures she had raised and bonded with lay beside her. The creatures were fragile and delicate, unlike Alira, who was used to the brutal realities of war. Their fur, once soft and strong, was now dry and matted with sweat, their once bright eyes now dull and clouded. They whimpered weakly, struggling to breathe, their tiny bodies shuddering in the heat. Alira's heart ached as she watched them suffer, knowing there was nothing she could do. The planet offered no water. She had already drained her supplies, trying to keep herself and her companions alive, but it was too late. The creatures were dying, and she could feel each painful breath they took. She had to do something. But what? She glanced around, desperate, for any sign of hope. Then a small beep came from her suit, a faint signal barely cutting through the howling wind. It was faint, but it was there. Her visor lit up, and the information blinked on her screen. One life form detected. Human. A human. On this forsaken planet? Alira's mind raced. She had never expected to encounter anyone here, let alone a human. The Uxari Empire had no alliances with Earth, and no humans were supposed to be anywhere near this sector. Yet the signal was clear. A human life form was nearby. She didn't hesitate. She needed to find them. Maybe they had water. Maybe they could help her save her pets. With renewed urgency, Alira scanned the horizon. The figure appeared at the top of a rocky ridge. Through the dust and the haze, she could see a lone figure stumbling down the steep incline, his movements sluggish. His face was obscured by a cracked helmet, and his clothes were torn. He was clearly injured, but alive. Alira's heart beat faster. He was carrying something in his hands, something metallic and small, a water canister. Her eyes locked onto it as if it were a lifeline thrown from the heavens. Her mouth went dry as she watched the human make his way down toward her. She took a deep breath and activated her plasma blade, instinctively preparing herself for a fight. She didn't know if this human was a friend or foe, but she wasn't about to let him get close without some kind of protection. Her serene were dying, and she wouldn't risk losing them for nothing. As the human came closer, Alira raised her voice, sharp and commanding. "State your name and purpose, human!" The words felt foreign in her mouth. Almost desperate, she didn't expect him to answer, but to her surprise, he raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm Lieutenant Rowan, Earth Fleet," he said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "I'm not here to fight. I just want to survive." Alira's eyes darted to the canister at his side. Without thinking, she demanded, "That water. Give it." The human didn't hesitate. He slowly unscrewed the cap of the canister, his hands trembling as he poured the precious liquid into her hands. She could hardly believe it. He had no way of knowing if she was going to kill him or let him live, yet he gave her his last drop of water without a second thought. It was the most selfless act she had ever witnessed, and it broke something inside her. She knelt down, placing the water next to the serene, and watched as the first of them drank. The others followed, their bodies slowly coming back to life, their energy returning. Alira's heart swelled with gratitude, and for the first time, since the crash, she allowed herself to feel something other than desperation. The human had saved them. But she knew the danger was far from over. The pirates who had destroyed her ship were still out there, and now they had made their way to Ferox 7. Alira stood, a new fire in her eyes. There was no time to waste. The battle for survival had just begun. Lieutenant Jake Rowan couldn't believe his eyes. He had stumbled into a nightmare. His ship had been torn apart in an ambush, and he had barely escaped with his life. The pirates had destroyed everything, leaving nothing but rubble and ash in their wake. His squad was gone, and his water supply had been nearly emptied in his desperate escape. He had walked for what felt like days, barely able to see straight from thirst and exhaustion. His clothes were torn, his skin burnt by the harsh sun. But he kept going, knowing he had to find help, or he'd never make it off this planet alive. The heat was unbearable, and every step felt like walking through fire. He had no map, no communication, and no idea where he was going. All he had left was a small water canister, the last of his supplies, and even that was almost gone. Then he saw her, Alira, the Uxari commander. He had never seen anything like her. She stood like a warrior, her violet skin glowing under the brutal sun, her golden armor shining even in the harsh desert light. Her presence was powerful, commanding respect without a single word. She was surrounded by 6 small creatures, their bodies trembling with weakness. At first, Jake thought they were animals of some kind, but the way she protected them, her eyes filled with worry and care, told him they were more than just pets. He had no idea who she was or what she was doing on this planet, but it didn't matter. She was his only hope. She was the first person he'd seen since the crash, and she had water. His body was begging for that life-saving liquid. But as he stumbled closer to her, he saw the pain in her eyes, the desperation. The creatures at her feet were dying from thirst, just as he had been. Jake felt a pang in his chest. He had always been taught to survive, to put himself first. But something about this alien woman, standing there with the creatures she clearly cared for, shifted something inside him. There was no choice to be made, not really. He couldn't just walk away from her. He had to help. Without a second thought, he reached for his canister and slowly unscrewed the cap. His hand trembled as he poured the last of his precious water into her hands. The droplets were few, but it was all he had left. As Alira knelt down, holding the water like it was the most sacred thing she had ever touched, Jake watched as the creatures slowly came to life, their energy returning as they drank. The first one took a long, desperate gulp, and then another. It was working. Alira raised her head, her eyes locking with Jake's. Her face was filled with gratitude, but there was something else too. Something unspoken between them. She knew the risk Jake had taken. He had nothing left. She had seen it in his eyes, the exhaustion, the hunger. Yet he had given up his last drop of water to save creatures he didn't even know. In that moment, Jake realized just how far humanity had come. He wasn't just a soldier of Earth anymore. He was something more. He was a force of compassion, a symbol of hope, even in the worst of circumstances. Alira stood, looking at him with a mixture of respect and awe. "You gave your last water," she said quietly, almost as if she couldn't believe it. Jake just smiled weakly, trying to hide the fatigue in his voice. "I didn't want them to die." She nodded, her gaze softening. There was no doubt in her mind now. This human, this soldier, had shown a strength that went beyond any weapon, beyond any battle. It was a strength of character, of selflessness, that Alira had never expected to see from anyone outside her own people. But their moment of peace didn't last long. The ground trembled, and a loud, low growl echoed across the desert. Alira's eyes snapped to the horizon, her expression hardening. She turned to Jake, her voice urgent. "We have company. Sand Reapers. They hunt anything alive." Jake didn't need any more explanation. He could see the fear in her eyes. and he could hear the growl growing louder. Without hesitation, he grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a nearby rock formation. The creatures had not fully recovered yet, but they were strong enough to move. Elira lifted the small ones into her arms as she ran, Jake following close behind, his mind racing. They were not alone on HFY 7, and now their battle for survival was about to become even harder. Oh, Minnie! The Sand Reapers were closing in fast, their dark figures moving across the horizon like shadows. They were massive, fearsome creatures, known for their sharp claws and insatiable hunger. Elira's mind raced as she sprinted, carrying two of the Serene in her arms, while the others followed as fast as they could manage. The sun was relentless, and her legs burned with every step. Jake was right behind her, his breath heavy and labored. But he stayed close, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. The growls of the Sand Reapers grew louder, more distinct, and Elira knew they didn't have much time before the creatures would be upon them. Jake had never faced anything like this before. He had seen his share of combat on Earth and in space, but these creatures were different. He didn't even know what they were. Their hulking forms were cloaked in the swirling sands, their features almost impossible to make out in the dust. All he could see were the massive claws and teeth, the reflection of the sun in their eyes as they stalked the survivors. They moved with a deadly precision, sensing weakness in the air, and there was no doubt in Jake's mind that they were hunting him and Elira now. He had to keep moving. He had to stay close to her, or they would never make it out alive. Elira's voice cut through the air as she shouted orders. "We need to find cover, now!" Her words were clipped, her usual calm demeanor replaced with urgency. She had fought many battles, but she knew this fight would be different. She had no idea how many Sand Reapers there were, and without proper weapons or enough water, she and Jake were at a severe disadvantage. Jake nodded, pushing his body harder. He was no stranger to running for his life, but the sand was shifting beneath his feet, making every step feel like he was sinking into quicksand. The sandstorm was thick, the winds howling in their ears, making it nearly impossible to see. He could barely make out the jagged rock formations that Elira had spotted earlier. It was their only chance. If they could make it to the cover of the rocks, they might have a chance to fight back, or at least survive long enough to escape. As they neared the rocks, Elira's voice came again, sharper this time. "Watch the rear. Don't let them get too close." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the small blaster holstered at his side. His weapon was a basic model, designed for self-defense, not for combat against something as monstrous as the Sand Reapers. But it was all he had. He didn't have much time to think. The ground rumbled again, and he could hear the faint scratching, sound of claws digging into the earth. They were almost there. Elira reached the rocks first, her body sliding behind a large boulder for cover. She lowered the Serene into a safe spot, and quickly turned back to Jake. Her gaze locked on his as he ran toward her, his face a mask of determination. The first Sand Reaper burst out of the sandstorm, its massive form towering over them. Its claws scraped the ground, sending sand flying in all directions. Its yellow eyes glowed with hunger. Elira didn't hesitate. She fired a series of quick shots from her weapon, the blasts striking the creature's tough hide but not stopping it. It let out a guttural roar, its eyes narrowing as it focused on them. Jake didn't wait for orders. He sprinted forward, firing his blaster with everything he had. The shots barely fazed the creature, but they did draw its attention. As the Sand Reaper turned toward him, Elira took advantage of the distraction, pulling her remaining Serene into the shelter of the rock and firing another round from her plasma rifle. The energy blast hit the creature square in the face, sending it reeling back with a shriek. The Sand Reaper stumbled, its massive form falling into the sand with a thud. Elira's breath was ragged, but she didn't slow down. There were more coming. Jake, still catching his breath, turned to her, his eyes wide with disbelief. How many of them are there? I don't know, Elira replied, her voice tight. But we can't stay here. We need to keep moving. Before Jake could respond, another Sand Reaper appeared, its massive body silhouetted against the rising dust. The creature's howl sent a shiver down his spine. There was no time to waste. They couldn't fight all of them. Elira, we have to get to the ship, Jake urged, his voice desperate. We can't keep running. We need a plan. Elira's expression hardened. She knew he was right. But getting to the ship would be no easy task. It was miles away, and they were surrounded by these creatures. Yet she knew there was no other choice. With one last look at Jake, she nodded. Move out. Stick close. We go together. As they dashed for the next rocky outcrop, the ground shook again, and another growl echoed in the distance. The Sand Reapers were closing in, but so was the hope of survival. Jake and Elira's fight had only just begun, and they would need every ounce of strength they had to make it out alive. Jake and Elira's escape from the Sand Reapers was becoming a race against time. Each step they took toward the distant ruins where Jake had crashed, the ground beneath them seemed to grow more unstable. The once solid rocks and sand dunes now felt treacherous, shifting with each movement. They were out of sight for a moment, but the growls of the Sand Reapers never stopped. They could hear the creatures' heavy breathing, their claws scraping the earth, drawing closer with each passing second. Elira kept moving, her pace steady, her eyes scanning for any sign of a safe hiding spot. She was a seasoned warrior, but even she knew that the Sand Reapers were relentless hunters. They would not give up easily, and every step was a gamble. Jake kept close to Elira, his eyes darting around the sandstorm that enveloped them. The storm was more than just a nuisance now. It was hiding the creatures, making it harder to track their movements. The only thing Jake could count on was his training and instincts, but even that didn't feel like enough against these monstrous hunters. The battle they had fought earlier had drained his energy, and now he was fighting to keep his focus. He hadn't been in this kind of situation before. In all his years of military service, he'd never faced creatures like the Sand Reapers, beasts that seemed to feed on fear and weakness. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of his boots crunching through the sand felt too loud in the eerie quiet that followed. Elira stopped suddenly, her hand raised to signal Jake to halt. She crouched down beside one of the rock formations, motioning for him to do the same. They were close now, too close. There was no way to outrun the Sand Reapers anymore. They had been tracking them since the first blast had gone off, and now they were nearly upon them. Elira's sharp eyes scanned the terrain ahead, looking for anything they could use to their advantage. There had to be a way out of this, she thought. She had survived worse odds. Jake crouched beside her, his pulse racing. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest. "What now?" he whispered, his voice tight. His hand tightened around his blaster. It was all they had. They couldn't outrun the creatures, and they couldn't fight them head-on without risking everything. Elira's face was unreadable, her mind already working through their options. She knew they had to make a stand, but they couldn't stay here. If they waited too long, they'd be trapped. "We need to get to the ship," she said, her voice low and decisive. "It's the only place we have a chance of holding them off." Jake nodded. He could feel the urgency in her tone. He didn't argue. They both knew they didn't have much time. They had to make it to the wreckage of the ship, where they might be able to find supplies or even weapons to fight back. It wasn't far, but getting there now seemed impossible. The ground shook again, and they both looked up. 2 Sand Reapers had appeared in the distance, their massive forms silhouetted against the shifting sands. They were moving fast. They had been spotted. Elira's voice was quiet but firm as she gave Jake one final order. "Run. We make it to the ship, no matter what." With a single shared glance, they were off again, running as fast as their legs would carry them. The wind howled around them, sand whipping at their faces, but neither of them slowed. Jake's lungs burned, and his muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't dare stop. Every second they wasted was another step closer to the Sand Reapers. They were gaining ground. Behind them, the earth trembled again, and Jake glanced over his shoulder to see the massive shapes of the creatures charging through the sandstorm, their claws digging into the earth with terrifying speed. The Reapers were closing in fast. There was no time to waste. Elira led the way, her speed unmatched, her movements smooth and practiced. She didn't even seem to notice the harsh terrain underfoot as she sprinted toward the wreckage, her focus sharp. Jake followed as best he could, but every now and then, his foot would sink into the sand and he would struggle to regain his footing. With every step, the sound of the Sand Reaper's growls grew louder, echoing in his ears. The adrenaline pumping through his veins helped him ignore the ache in his body, but he knew they couldn't outrun them forever. They had to reach the ship before it was too late. Elira glanced over her shoulder briefly and shouted, "Keep moving! They're right behind us!" Jake pushed himself harder. The shipwreck was only a few hundred yards away now, but it felt like a lifetime. He could see the twisted metal and broken hull of the ship rising against the horizon. But it still seemed so far. With one last burst of energy, they reached the wreckage. Jake didn't look back. He dove into the shadow of the ship, rolling behind the twisted frame of what had once been the command center. Elira was already moving, her eyes scanning the area for anything useful. They were momentarily shielded from the Sand Reaper's view, but Jake knew it wouldn't last long. They had to make a plan, and fast. Elira looked at him, her expression grim but determined. "We fight or we die," she said quietly. "Make it count." As Jake and Elira crouched behind the wreckage of the ship, the sound of the Sand Reaper's growls grew louder, closer. The creatures were relentless, their massive forms moving through the sandstorm with terrifying precision. The wind howled around them, carrying the scent of danger. Elira knew they didn't have much time. She was scanning the wreckage of the ship, her mind racing through potential strategies, but nothing felt like enough. She had been in countless life-or-death situations, but this was different. These creatures weren't like anything she had ever faced before, and there were more of them. The few shots they had fired earlier had only temporarily distracted the creatures, but now they were too close. Elira's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the pressure of knowing that every decision she made could be the difference between life and death. Jake's mind was similarly spinning. He had fought in wars, had seen the horrors of alien invasions, and galaxy-shattering conflicts. But this was nothing like that. The Sand Reapers weren't just an enemy to be defeated. They were predators, and he and Elira were their prey. The thought of being cornered, of being devoured by these massive beasts, sent a chill down his spine. He didn't have much left to fight with. His blaster had only a few shots remaining, and he had no idea what they could do to stop the creatures that were closing in on them. His instincts screamed at him to act, to do something. But what? They were outgunned, outmatched, and out of time. The shipwreck was their only chance. Elira had seen something in the wreckage, some old weapons perhaps, or systems that could give them an advantage. She had to make it work. There was no other option. But as she moved toward the wreck, a Sand Reaper burst from the sandstorm, its massive form emerging like a nightmare. It had spotted them, and it wasn't alone. The ground rumbled beneath them as another creature appeared behind it. Elira cursed under her breath, her hand instinctively reaching for her plasma rifle. Jake wasn't far behind her, his blaster ready, but both of them knew it wouldn't be enough to stop these creatures. Elira quickly assessed the situation. There were 2 Sand Reapers now, maybe more hidden in the storm. They couldn't fight them off in the open, not without more weapons or reinforcements. They needed to outsmart the creatures. She turned to Jake, her voice low and urgent. "We need to lead them into the wreckage. It'll provide cover." Jake looked at her, his face grim. "Are you sure this will work?" "No choice," she replied, her tone steady. "If we stay here, they'll pick us off one by one." With no time to waste, they moved into position. Elira signaled Jake to take the left side of the wreck while she took the right. They would need to separate, confuse the creatures, and lead them into the narrow confines of the wreckage. The Sand Reapers, with their enormous size and strength, wouldn't be able to navigate the tight spaces as easily as they could in the open. It was a risky move, but it was their only chance. The creatures were closing in, their massive claws scraping against the sand as they hunted their prey. Elira and Jake exchanged one last glance before they began to move. Elira fired a few shots in the air to grab the Sand Reaper's attention. The creatures growled in response, their eyes locking onto her. That was all the distraction they needed. Elira quickly dashed toward the wreck, weaving through the debris, with Jake right behind her. As they reached the wreckage, the first Sand Reaper lunged, its claws swiping through the air just inches from Elira's side. She ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding the strike. Jake wasn't far behind, his blaster firing shots at the creature's face, forcing it to stumble back. The second Sand Reaper roared in anger, charging toward them. Elira and Jake quickly dove into the wreckage, just as the first creature followed. The narrow corridors of the ship would slow them down, but they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Elira led the way, her eyes darting around as she tried to find a way to turn the wreckage to their advantage. The Sand Reapers were larger than anything she had fought before, but they weren't built for maneuvering in cramped spaces. If they could keep the creatures inside the wreckage long enough, they might be able to use the ship's systems to their advantage. She spotted what she needed, a control panel, hidden in the wreckage, barely functional but still active. She rushed toward it, her heart racing. If she could power up the ship's defensive systems, they might have a chance. Jake kept close, firing his blaster to hold off the creatures as they closed in. The first Sand Reaper was almost upon them, but the narrow corridor kept it from reaching them immediately. Elira reached the control panel, her fingers flying over the damaged keys. The ship's systems flickered to life, the lights dimmed, and then a series of defensive barriers activated, locking down parts of the wreckage. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The Sand Reapers were trapped inside. For a moment, there was silence. Elira's breath came in short gasps as she turned to Jake. They had made it. The creatures were contained for now, and the ship's systems would keep them at bay. But Elira knew this wasn't over. They were alive, for the moment. But there were still too many dangers out there, and they couldn't stay trapped in this wreck forever. They had to keep moving. They had to find a way out. Jake and Elira stood in the wreckage of the ship, surrounded by the faint hum of the defensive systems Elira had activated. For a moment, it felt like they were safe, but both of them knew it wasn't the end of the fight. The Sand Reapers were still out there, locked behind the ship's walls, but they wouldn't stay trapped forever. The creatures were intelligent and dangerous. They could break through, and the clock was ticking. Elira glanced over at Jake, who was catching his breath, his grip still tight on his blaster. The sweat on his brow mirrored her own. Their plan had worked, for now, but it was only a temporary solution. The wreckage wasn't big enough to keep the Sand Reapers contained for long. They had to keep moving. The ship's defensive system wasn't perfect. The panels flickered, signaling that power was still unstable, and the lights dimmed occasionally. Elira knew it wouldn't be long before the Sand Reapers broke through or found a way to disable the systems. They didn't have much time. Elira quickly began scanning the wreckage, looking for anything that could help them escape. She knew the ship's layout, having spent time with the crew before the crash, and she had an idea of where the escape pods were located. If they could reach them, they might have a chance to get off the planet. But the distance was still far, and the wreckage was unstable. Jake didn't need to be told. His mind was already working in the same direction. He'd fought in many battles, but this situation was unlike any other. There was no backup, no reinforcements, just him and Elira, stranded on a hostile world with deadly creatures hunting them. They were on their own. Still, Jake trusted Elira. She had led them this far, and he knew she had the experience to get them out. Together, they had survived against impossible odds before. There was a chance they could do it again. Elira gave Jake a sharp nod, and they began moving quickly through the wreckage, careful not to make any unnecessary noise. Every step had to count. The Sand Reapers were only moments away from finding a way out, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. Elira's eyes were darting from one piece of debris to the next, looking for the quickest route to the escape pods. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her veins as they navigated through the narrow, twisting passages of the ship. They reached a section of the wreckage where the walls were crumpled, leaving a hole large enough to climb through. Elira led the way, crawling through the gap with ease. Jake followed closely behind her, his movements quick and fluid. As they emerged into the next chamber, they heard the unmistakable sound of the Sand Reaper's claws scraping against metal. The creatures had broken through one of the barriers, and they were getting closer. The noise was deafening, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. They had no time to waste. They moved faster now, pushing themselves harder. Elira's mind was racing. She knew the escape pods were just ahead, but she also knew that the Sand Reapers wouldn't stop. If they reached the pods and couldn't escape in time, they would be trapped. There was no way they could fight the creatures off for long. She had to act quickly. Her eyes scanned the wreckage, finally landing on the access panel for the escape pods. It was located at the end of a long corridor, and as they sprinted down the hallway, Elira's heart was pounding in her chest. She could hear the creatures moving closer. Jake kept pace with her, firing his blaster behind them to slow the Sand Reapers down. It worked for a moment, but the creatures were persistent. The sound of their growls filled the air, and Elira could feel their presence getting closer. They couldn't stop. They had to keep moving. They reached the access panel, and Elira quickly worked to override the system. She had no time to waste. The Sand Reapers were almost upon them. Sweat was dripping down her face as she punched in the override codes, praying the system would respond. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Elira cursed under her breath, but just as she was about to give up, the panel flickered to life. The door to the escape pod chamber slid open. Elira wasted no time, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him inside. They both rushed into the chamber, and the door sealed behind them with a loud thud. Inside the pod, Elira began the launch sequence. Her fingers flew over the controls, her mind focused on one goal: escape. The pod's engines roared to life as she worked to activate the thrusters. Just as she was about to engage the final sequence, the door to the chamber burst open with a deafening crash. One of the Sand Reapers had made it inside. Elira didn't hesitate. She slammed her hand down on the launch button, and the pod shot upward into the atmosphere, leaving the wreckage and the planet below. As the pod rocketed into space, Elira and Jake collapsed into their seats, exhausted but alive. The Sand Reapers were left behind on the surface, and the immediate threat was gone. For the moment, they had won. But the battle wasn't over. There were still dangers out there, and they had no idea what awaited them in the vastness of space. But as the pod sailed through the stars, Elira knew one thing for certain. Humanity had proven once again that no matter the odds, they could survive. The Sand Reapers had underestimated them, and that mistake would cost them dearly.